Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry, with Mage the Podcast. And today, my guest is Ranae. And she will be talking to us about Hunter the Reckoning, one of the top 3 hunters in the world of darkness, among Reckoning, Vigil, and H5, which briefly had a cover that looked like they were doing a gritty reboot of the Wes Anderson expanded universe, which honestly I would have been here for. But that is for a different episode. Hey, Ranae, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm going to go with acceptable. My spouse is traveling to a place I had left like 12 hours before her. So we tried to arrange this weird thing where I went to a cake place. And I think the person vending cakes and I had like a little bit of chemistry because he hands me this spoon and he's like, try this ganache. And I'm like, this isn't a ganache, I don't think. This is like, there's no notes of dairy. He's like, oh, do you bake? And I'm like, do I? And like slowly this line is forming behind us as we're talking about like chiffon cakes. And he's like, most people call them chiffon cakes, but they don't even use vegetable oil for it. Like, I'm like, I know, they just use it as a synonym for just being light. And there's this line forming behind me. I'm like, do I need to go so you can serve them? And he's like, don't worry about them. And I'm like, ooh, this just went up a level. So that's how I'm doing in a slightly too detailed sense. But we're talking about Hunter the Reckoning. How did you get involved with this crazy little game?
I've actually been playing games since I was a kid. Actually, my dad used to run D&D and stuff like that. Freshman, sophomore year of high school, I was at a school and they had second edition copies of the core books for both Vampire and Mage, and that got me into the world of darkness as a whole. So when the revised era came about with the after the Week of Nightmares and they released Hunter and Mummy and Demon and all that, I was eating them up. White Wolf used to have their own DigiChat off their website called New Bremen that was official, and then they had a Dark Ages one called Old Bremen, and I was one of the assistant storytellers on New Bremen.
Interesting. So you talked about getting involved with the TUI of the World of Darkness. What got you into Hunter specifically?
Hunter the Reckoning is a very different game from the rest of the World of Darkness a lot of times. The closest analog I could give to it from the older stuff is Hunter's Hunted. You know, your Inquisition, your Arcanum, etc. Except Reckoning is basically like with the Hunter's Hunted stuff, and like later with when they did Chronicles of Darkness with Hunter the Vigil. With those, you kind of work with an organization who already has some fundamental understanding. Reckoning was more, this is something that could happen to me. It's like my eyes have just suddenly been opened to this new level of understanding of the world, and I don't know what to make of it. And every hunter is their own interpretation of what's going on. That is a much more personal level of role playing than you get sometimes. So it's one of the things that like street level games for Mage are much more gritty and personal than the higher going out to the Umbra and fighting star squids and whatnot, or the more political machinations of Vampire.
Mages, they all have willpower 5. They are in some way kind of better than baseline. Werewolves have this weird lineage and so on, but it really seems like Hunter is a thing where it's like, oh, that could happen to me, as opposed to the other lines. And so yeah, it's kind of a fascinating little artifact, and it seems to have like different mood and theme than a lot of the other games. Like the nature of the personal horror seems to kind of be different. In this game, do you consider the playing characters to be horrible in some way, in the same way that maybe they would be in Wraith or Vampire?
I think that it's very much a horror genre, but it very much has that horror. But I don't know that the characters themselves are horrible. You know, they're not monsters that, you know, like the vampires who have to, like, I have to feed on others to survive. I mean, hunters do that, but do have, like, some hunters will kill. But the thing is, even the term hunter is kind of a misnomer. They call, a lot of them will call themselves the imbued, is kind of the more common term that you'll hear, because a lot of them don't actually hunt the supernatural to kill them. You definitely have your monstrous characters, player characters, but as a whole, I don't think it would be that way.
So let's talk about what a hunter is. You made mention to the imbued. What do you play in the game Hunter, and kind of how do you become one? Is there a general backstory for an hunter?
You work in an office, you know, you work with math. Picture yourself, you're at work one day, maybe tomorrow morning, you're sitting there in your office, your cubicle or whatever, you're looking at your spreadsheets, and
This got very personal very quickly. Go on.
you blink and suddenly everything changes on it. And now all you see on your screen is 2 words: death walks. You blink again and it's changed back to what it was. And suddenly you hear, one of your coworkers come walking by, and as they come approach, you smell this foul, rotting odor, and you look up at them. And instead of the person that you are familiar with, you see a rotting corpse. And you have suddenly this overpowering urge that something is wrong and you must act upon it. That is the imbuing. And depending on how you act and respond to that, you either become one of the imbued, and what your response is determines maybe what your creed is, which is what their little individual smaller groups are, or you become what they call a bystander. Like if you run away or just freeze up or whatever, you lose all your power. You don't gain any of the powers, you get any of the benefits, but you still realize at that point that the supernatural is real.
So it sounds like there are two parts of it. For whatever reason, you are exposed to and open up to the fact that there is something else out there in the world. You gain some other sight or some other sense. And then you get a option to act on it. Is that option induced at all? Does anything nudge you towards action? Or is that entirely up to this person who now has this other sight?
Yes and no. Like I said, there's that urging sense of you need to act, you need to do something, but it is nothing. It doesn't force you to act. What you do is your choice, how you respond. The people who are picked typically be ones who will act in some way, but it's not like, oh, everybody who gets picked is going to go, oh my God, there's a zombie, let me kill it.
Do they maintain that special sight in some way, or is that now gone?
The bystander will now lose their sight, and even hunters do not have the sight active at all times. It's actually a package of built-in powers that they call second sight. Most of the time, they do not have it active. Their fuel little source that they call, like quintessence for mages, is called conviction. Upon spending a point of conviction, they can activate for one scene their second sight with all of its benefits. And what it does is, first and foremost, it lets them detect the supernatural for what it is. Now, this might not necessarily give them any information, and even looking at the same entity multiple times over multiple scenes will have different results. What they see, one time they might see a rotting corpse, another time they might look at that person and see just blood dripping from their mouth. But it also lets them see hidden or invisible supernatural entities. So ghosts who are on this side of the shroud, vampires or mages who are using their magical abilities to hide themselves, that kind of stuff. They see right through that. They're immune to mental and emotional control. So your mind magic isn't going to do anything to a hunter who has their second sight active. The reverse of this is when they don't have their second sight active, they are normal everyday people. They're just as vulnerable to mind magic and delirium and what have you as anyone else. There is an optional rule, which most storytellers will use, where when they are exposed to something like that, they can make a reaction roll to try and activate their second sight to protect them. But
what causes this awakening, for lack of a better term, or what causes this widening of awareness? What entity or supernatural power or inner light allows that to occur?
It's funny that you give that listing because every hunter has their own interpretation of what it is. Some are like, oh, it's aliens. Some are, oh, it's angels or God. Others are saying, oh, we're the immune system of the earth here, trying to cleanse the infection of the creatures. They give the official answer of what these beings are that are most commonly as the messengers. You'll also hear them called, the heralds and so on, because every hunter has their own interpretation of them. And the official answer is really highly tied into the overall backstory and lore of the World of Darkness. With Revised, they did a really good job of trying to create a concise canon for what everything is. And what that lore basically is it's very much attuned with the Gnostic belief of like the demiurge, that you have the creator, the God, God who cursed Cain and all that was this imperfect creator. Throughout the ages, this being has had their angels create heroes throughout the ages to try and fix the world, and every single time in the past they've screwed up. One of those was probably the Exalted back in the day. This was back before they officially said that Exalted was not part of the World of Darkness, like not an earlier age. One of these groups was definitely what became the Kuei Jin, and eventually the creator turned their back on this world and ordered all of the angels to do the same. Two of those angels kind of stayed behind and said, yeah, we're going to try to keep an eye on it, especially the events of the Week of Nightmares with Zarathustra running around in technocracy dropping their spirit nukes there and with Xerxes Jones and everything that happened. It's just that huge thing drew the attention back of those two, who in Kuei-jin lore would be the Scarlet Dragon and the Ebon Dragon and the Scarlet Phoenix or something along those lines. Scarlet Queen, yeah. And these two are actually two of the angels of like Demon the Fallen lore. And they went, oh, wow, this world is even worse shape than we thought it would be. We need to do something, and we're going to try to get one more turn of the wheel of the cycle of it, to get through, just get one more cycle out of this thing. And so they went around and started creating hunters. When they started, they didn't realize that humanity had fallen. And the first groups that they did, they broke those individuals. They are absolutely shattered. They're what they're called the lost creeds, because they're not really known as individual creeds to the wider hunter community, because their proximity to the messengers causes them to automatically have a derangement at character creation, whereas other hunters don't start picking up derangements from proximity until they get really far in their career. One of the kind of themes of that hunter can run with is what price is power, because as you get more powerful in the hunt and more dedicated, your mind starts kind of falling into derangements and picking them up as you become more focused on your aspect of the creed or whatever. So the messengers are like, they went, okay, we screwed this up. We're going to come back even further. And that's why you have most hunters, they get that initial message that death walks, it feeds on the living. And then that's it. They don't have any interaction with the messengers again, the rest of their careers.
So they are tapped. These entities, these messengers, seem pretty potent in terms of overall power. Lucifer claims that they are the last two Elohim running around in creation. Again, one of the things to note about Demon is Demon the Fallen generally views everything through the lens of Demon the Fallen. So it is a game where disproportionately the characters in it will be like, of course they're a demon. So it seems obviously that this is one of those change it if you want it kind of things. They have a tie as the Ebon Dragon and the Scarlet Queen, or the Scarlet Phoenix, who were the ministers of creation known well to the Kuei-jin, who are the fallen Wanjian, or the Gui Ren, who were an interesting collection of creatures that were kind of presented in Kindred of the East as these dead creatures, these fallen great warriors who have the ability to kind of purify themselves. And as you mentioned, this all ties together during the Week of Nightmares when Zapathasura, the ravenous antediluvian, rises in Bangladesh and bad things happen. But you also mentioned that there may be a tie to Exalted, depending on how canon one wants to do. They may tie to the Solar Exalted, and the fact that as they tap power, they may kind of go loco seems to tie in nicely with the idea of the great curse that we get in Exalted, that over time they will develop kind of their own sense of hubris that will eventually snap and cause bad things. And you mentioned that as a self-preservation method, the messengers are like, boop, and then they kind of peace. Since this is a game where you kind of open your third eye out of nowhere, what systems are in place to kind of help a new hunter do the work that the messengers have set them out, which seems to be quick cleanup creation before the bad guys ruin everything?
Basically, not a whole lot. Like I said earlier, it's a very individualistic kind of thing. The closest thing you have to a global hunter organization is a listserv that is run by a character who's known by as Witness One. Everyone that joins picks their screen name, and then they have the number of what they joined is attached to the end of their thing. So he's the creator of it. He's Witness One. You have other characters like God 45, Bookworm 55, and so on. This listserv he just runs it. Hunter One, Witness runs it, and he's the one that gives the thing of the message that he got when he had his imbuing was the weak shall inherit the earth, or the meek, or some version, or it was inherit the earth, I believe. So he creates this listserv, and the messengers protect it unless the messengers specifically direct supernatural entities there, which they have done before. It's usually in the form of the various antagonist books for the different types of supernatural beings that the hunters deal with, which at the end of the book, they get booted back off the server. Supernatural creatures can't find it. Hunters may find it. They have a unique ability to see and create these little glyphs that are, lines and circles, special little shapes like that they just instinctively understand. But again, because Hunter is so individual, each one will interpret that glyph in a slightly different way. For example, each creed has their own little glyph for what their creed is, but a more zealous hunter, for example, might look at the glyph for the innocent creed and read it as bait, naive, or something like that. And that's one of the things that makes Mage and Hunter crossover actually work so well, is they're both very personalized games for the individual characters.
Let's start laying some very preliminary mage hooks. Your mage encounters a character that seems to have some sort of other sight and doesn't fit neatly into one of the buckets of mortals they've run into. Or maybe they bear witness to one of these cases where the heralds or messengers activate someone. Maybe that is something that is possible to understand through Prime. My recommendation is that this either require entropy or correspondence to be the special add-on sphere, because we don't have that yet. A lot of the other spheres are taken up when trying to tie to a particular type of night folk. Or a mage comes through and sees glyphs that, for all their magic, they cannot decrypt it or figure it out. Or a virtual adept comes across this sector that they just can't penetrate at all. Or maybe they come across these user tags used somewhere else. So we have kind of those preliminary things. Or there are some sort of umbral activity that people talk about, the return of the angels, in a particularly weird or hidden way. And these are kind of our step zero before we've even met a hunter, maybe in our Mage Chronicle or our crossover or what have you. They're just these weird little quakes or ideas of something that's come out. And as you mentioned, each hunter is going to see it through their own lens. With that, when you say that, I hear paradigm. So what other basics do you think we need to know at this point to kind of get what a hunter is?
You mentioned paradigm is kind of a fitting thing, is they actually had exactly one other part of the world book. It was for, I believe it was the Year of the Scarab book. And in it, they actually introduced new edges for each of the creeds based on the cultural aspect of their living there in the Middle East.
Was that Holy War?
Yeah, it was Holy War. They only had one edge per creed of the 6 creeds they represent, because Holy War was mostly good, but it did have its issues. For example, the book was very heavily Islamic focused. They look at it as each of their 6 creeds. They don't recognize martyrs as a creed out there. And each of the creeds that they have is depicted as one of the, it's technically by whichever form of Islam you follow is the 5 pillars, but they don't always agree on what exactly the 5 pillars are. So they've got, it's the 6 pillars. But, for example, their innocence. Most innocents, their first edge that they get is the ability to hide themselves and become unobtrusive, like just below notice. Their version in the Middle East has the ability to transfer that to someone else and put it on a normal human being, because of their cultural, more communal nature than it would be, say, here in the United States, where it's very much an individual.
This seems like a good way to keep a group on their toes. If this becomes a recurring theme and there's world transit, maybe a hunter group brings in a contact from outside of the area after the mages have seemingly learned most of their tricks, that you can still have kind of a deep bench. You made mention to creeds and edges. What are the creeds?
Creed is what they call the individual type of hunters. Officially, there are 9. Hunter runs really heavily on the rule of 3. There are 3 virtues that hunters all adhere to. Each virtue has 3 creeds beneath it that have that as their primary virtue. And you can think of the creeds as having like a secondary one of the virtues. So you have like your Avenger creed is your, zeal primary with a zeal secondary, whereas your Defender would be zeal primary with a mercy second. Within each creed, you also have what they call camps, kind of your sub-factions. And they're not really sub-factions in the sense of like the Aetheronautical Society would be for the Society of Aether as its own little sub-faction. It's more of perspective. And most of them will call them, liberal, moderate, conservative kind of thing, with being, merciful, visionary, or zealous as a tertiary. But it's really what your outlook is for how you approach the hunt, the mission, whatever you call it. Your merciful creeds, for example, are going to be your redeemers, who are the ones who look at the supernatural and go, these poor infected individuals, we must help them. They'll have powers early on about interacting with the supernatural in ways like their first level power that they typically get from the core book is one that they can call out, like a shout out, just like, no, and it'll help protect someone, take successes away from an attack roll, or, it works even if there's no intention. An oncoming car with the brakes have failed. It can work on that. Later on, they'll get healing abilities, and each creed has its own unique ability to like craft something that they can do. And so like the Redeemers can craft something that allows, say, a vampire to not have to feed on blood as much. The opposite extreme, like I mentioned, your Avengers, and everyone thinks of Avengers when they think of Hunter the Reckoning. It's like the iconic, I'm going out there and I'm going to kill the supernatural. They're actually more nuanced than most people give them credit for. And they're the ultimate victims of the world of darkness even. they've been victimized before, and they now want to avenge both themselves and those who have been victimized by the supernatural. So they don't necessarily go, that's a werewolf, I'm going to go stab a spoon through it. They are the more aggressive ones, the Avengers are. And you have kind of everything in between those two extremes of the ultra merciful or the ultra zealous. In the core book, you had 7 different creeds. The 3 mercy creeds are redeemers, who, they want to heal. The martyrs, who look at the supernatural, look at themselves and go, we're the same. Let's address it. They're kind of your more zealous, merciful. And then you have your innocents, who literally take the whole individual basis thing to an extreme. And they treat every supernatural creature as an individual, and they try to learn from them or study them or whatnot. Igahana character, Bookworm 55, for example, he actually has a wizard friend who I believe is a hermetic that he calls Purple, learns from. That's a great example of how you can have a beneficial relationship between the two, because it's not clear what Purple thinks of him. And he calls him Purple as like a code name. He has this ability called Illuminate. It's one of the detection edges. And it causes him to shine with this light that the supernatural beings can see, but then he can see these auras of color around them that tells him what kind of supernatural being they are. So to him, mages show up in a purple aura.
These are all interesting angles on the different views that a imbued could have when encountering your characters. Do different creeds mix into a group?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where it's not unreasonable that we make first contact with a innocent who is just like, no, you are just a different kind of weirdo. Don't worry about my Avenger friend who is trying to wipe you off the face of the planet. And the Avenger is like, you're lucky innocent is here. The moment you turn on us, you're getting an attack from the 10th sphere gun.
It can be that, or it can actually be, you can have 2 opposing hunter groups, and you see this a lot in the fiction within the Creed books. So you can have, example, like I said, like a lot of those more zealous ones will look at the innocent as bait. And so they'll be like, okay, he's great at detecting the supernatural. We'll throw him out there, and if he gets killed, whatever. He does serve his job.
This is not a game of super friends. Just because they are all imbued does not mean they're all besties looking out for each other's best interests.
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
And one of the things that comes up later on, when you do get super high power, hunters can only get to the level 4 of their powers naturally, and then they have 3 routes to get their 5th level power. And one of those powers, those means, is through infernal contracts. And so one of there's 2 of the signature characters, one of which who thinks she's serving an angel, but is actually serving a demon, and she's being hunted by another one.
Now, when you say demon, is that a Malfian thing or a demon special in this game?
I would interpret it as one of the Earthbound from Demon the Fallen.
We have these groups, they may be mixed, they may be somewhat adversarial, which makes sense. And the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking through these different things are actually views of the traditions from within the technocracy.
Mm-hmm. One of the nice things that you guys did the reviews not too long ago on the last 4 revised convention books. And a lot of those, you look at it like, for example, the Void Engineers, like, dude, we can use these guys. They're just like exceptional citizens. Just kind of point them at something that's not as lethal.
You talked about the mercy creeds of the innocents, the martyrs, and the redeemers. What other creeds and kind of how are they lumped together?
Also, you have your 3 zeal creeds. And when I say mercy and zeal, these aren't necessarily what you think of them. They're closer to what we would call yin and yang here in the West. The actual Chinese pronunciation would be yin and yang. Your mercy is your more passive, deal with the supernatural on its own basis, whereas your zeal are more active. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to do this. And you have your Avengers who, like I mentioned earlier, kind of like I'm going to stop you from victimizing. You've already hurt some people. You have your defenders who are very much, the name says it. It's like, this is what I love. This is what I must protect. And then you have your judges, as the name suggests. Most of the creed names are kind of self-explanatory. But the judges are the ones who go, okay, I need to determine, do we need to put you down? Can we spare you? That kind of thing. And then your last of the base 7 creeds is your visionary. And your visionaries are just kind of, they're the leaders of the imbued. They're the ones who have that balance between the 2 extremes. They tend to have a more long view of things. The 2 lost creeds are what were called the waywards and the hermits. The lost creeds are special. For most hunters, when they get their virtues, they start with 3 points in their 3 virtues. But the virtues range from 1 to 10, or 0 rather, to 10. So once you start getting to like 7, 8, 9, 10, at those points, most hunters will start getting a derangement at each of those points when they get up there. Lost creeds, They don't get those until 9 and 10 because they're already so connected to the messengers, but they start with 1 as well. But they also have us to connect that special connection that they have. They also have special abilities that come with it. Other hunters can change their creed over time as they change their personality, their approach to it. So, for example, an Avenger can become a martyr. The Lost Creeds cannot do that. They are made specifically this way. Your Waywards, they have the vision aspects of the second sight always active. They cannot turn it off. But they are also, the derangements that their brain is broken to is a very aggressive, tends to be very aggressively. They were designed to be the war generals of the hunters. Whereas the hermits, the opposite extreme, they have a much stronger connection to the messengers. There's a background determines, like for most hunters, you start with 0, and that's like your imbuing is the only time you hear from them. As you get more points in this background, the messengers will still continue sending you messages here and there from that. Hermits start with a default 3 points in that, but they also have this thing that whenever they come close to the supernatural entities, including other hunters, they suddenly just get overwhelmed with like what they call the static. And imagine it's like 3 different radio stations all coming through the same speakers all at the same time kind of thing. It's just this jumble of noise that they can maybe pick out fragments of it. It hurts them. It causes pain. And so they're driven away from interacting with others, but their powers give them a great ability to communicate with others. They can actually send their senses or higher levels astral project out, So you have your 9 creeds. The 2 Lost Creeds, like I said, are absolutely just created. And the other 7, like I said, they can change their viewpoint over time. They can shift that. But the whole intention from the messengers is you have your 3 virtues. The zealous are intended to deal with the supernatural creatures that are monsters, the ones that cannot be spared. The merciful are the ones who are there to deal with the ones who can be spared, help bring them to a more holy or unified interaction with humanity. And the visionaries are there to determine which is which. This is a world where the creator, his angels, all of these are not perfect beings. They're fallible. They screw up. Hunters are just they left to their own devices, and they just have to find their own path. They're a lot like orphans. In fact, I think a game with orphans and hunters works really well together. You have one of them just turn to the other going, "What the hell are you?" And it's like, "I don't know. What about you? You think I know?"
Yeah. Each of them is seeing the world through their own kind of view. There's no one there to correct them.
Exactly. And they both have gone through something that has forced them to realize this world's a lot more than they thought they understood.
I like the idea that they introduce that. You mentioned that there are these kind of like 3 kind of arete stats that they have, that we have the virtues of mercy, vision, and zeal. It seems like that is a track that you can increase over time, and you can spend points from it, as well as being able to spend points from that conviction pool. I like that there is a space on the character sheet for derangements that is like, hey, you're going to need to deal with this. To me, if this is something we want to steal from Mage, I could perfectly understand being a thing where it's like, well, yeah, your arete gets high enough without really working on it. You're going to start picking up quiet whether you want to or not, or you're going to start picking up some weird supernatural flaws, but enough to indicate to the outside world that you are changing. And the game that comes to mind is Changeling the Lost, where as your ability to manipulate the weird increases, at certain points you automatically kind of get these points where you are now subject to certain myths and legends or something like that. As your power stat increases, every few points there's a new glitch in the armor that kind of arises of necessity.
I think that was one of the things that Chronicles of Darkness did as a whole, and it did real well, is the whole idea of as you get more blood potency, more whatever, you get more separated from the real world. Hunters are very much not. They can't leave this world if they want. They can't see, like what I mentioned earlier, their second sight, they can see ghosts that are on this side of the shroud. Even if they're at a shallowing or a nihil or something like that, they cannot see into the Umbra or the Shadowlands or anything like that. Neither can they travel. If a mage were to try and force them to it, it would do nothing. The mage is fighting with the messengers at that point.
Kind of seems interesting that if that is diegetically the case, that is a good reason why a mage and a hunter may need to do the buddy cop drama, where it's like the source of this taint that you're dealing with, whether it be a bunch of Giovanni that are dealing with something in the abyss or something like that, or across the shroud or something like that. I guess La Sombra would be more appropriate for the abyss, or a bunch of werewolves that keep stepping sideways or what have you. This is the buddy cop moment where they're like, well, I don't like you and you don't like me, but I physically can't go to this other place.
Mm-hmm.
And finding that out, I particularly see something like a Nefandas or a Pentax agent trying to drag someone off to somewhere to show these no good hunters what's up, and they just can't. That can also go in the, that's kind of different category. Yep. How do you increase these virtues, and what does it mean to spend virtue?
Well, you don't actually spend the virtues, to correct you on that first. What you have is you have conviction is what you spend. And conviction is, each creed starts with a default of either 3 or 4, depending on if, like, the ones that start with 4 are what I would consider your zeal secondaries, your avengers, your martyrs, and your waywards. All the others start with 3. And the way that conviction works is you can use it. You spend a single conviction to activate your second sight power. Some of your higher level powers will also require some to be spent. But what you can do is, once per scene, you can also risk conviction dice. You can say, okay, I'm going to risk 3 conviction on this edge. It has to be specifically your powers, which are called edges. You can then take however many points you're risking, you can add that many dice to that roll. If the roll succeeds, you gain a point of conviction. If the roll fails, you lose all that conviction that you risked. It works kind of like nature and demeanor with willpower, where if you are acting in accordance with your creed and its standards of, innocence, redemption, vengeance, what have you, then you can also gain conviction from that. When your conviction hits 10, you then gain a point in one of your 3 virtues. That's between you and the storyteller, and then you get reset back to your creed's default normal. The way your virtues work is they're kind of like any other dot on your sheet, but they're specifically for using your powers. So, like, for example, you're rolling attribute plus whatever the primary virtue for that creed, what the path of that edge is from, because the paths are associated with each creed. So your defender ones, for example, would use one of their starter one called Ward, which allows you to create a bubble around you that pushes supernatural creatures out, runs off stamina plus zeal. So the further you get into that, the more powerful your edges become, the less likely they are to fail. So now you're starting with, you might just say, I'm going to risk 1, or I'm going to risk 2, instead of I'm going to risk all 4. And so you'll start building more and more conviction faster and faster as well that way.
Oh, interesting. So this is it seems to be a bit of a flywheel mechanic. If you have it high, you can spend a lot, you can get a win, and that surge of confidence causes you to get additional points, which can help you power up your virtues, which give you bigger dice pools on some of your stuff.
Yeah. And it's kind of like spending it, we'll say, is the edges you have are limited by your virtues in that path. So, for example, you start with 3 points. You can distribute them however you want. You can do 1 in each, or a 2 in 1, or all 3 in 1. Your third, but if you're the one that has to be highest is your primary. So an innocent, for example, is a primary mercy. I can choose to do 3 level 1 edges, or I can do a level 1 and a level 2 edge of my creed. Maybe I'll just do 1 there, 1 from over here, and I'll spare that 1 there. Because so the way you get your powers is not through experience, it's through the higher your virtues. So example, if I've got 3 mercy and I've spent 1 on innocence, but I also wanted the level 1 martyr one. Well, I have to wait until I get mercy 4 to get my level 2 edge. And unless I'm using an optional roll that says, okay, yeah, you can get those other edges with experience or something like that, I will never get my level 4 edge. And the level 3 and level 4 edges are really where it's at. Most of your level 1 and 2 edges are actually not combat focused. A lot of people look at Hunter the Reckoning and like, oh, it's so combat focused. But most of your level 1 and 2 edges are either better detection of the supernatural, like, for example, that Illuminate edge I was talking about that creates the auras, or they give you more information about what kind of supernatural entity you're dealing with, the weaknesses for it or something like that. Or they are ones that help you protect either yourself or others. The one big exception to that is the Avenger Creed. They get 1 combat edge that lets them do a little bit more damage. And
we increase the virtues. Virtues are what allow us to buy those edges. So spending it is kind of an experience or ability tracking thing. Okay, that makes sense.
When you max out at 10, well, you've got 1 point for your level 1, 2 points for your 2, 3 for 3, and 4 for 4. Well, now you can't get your level 5 edges, but they do have level 5 edges listed in the book.
Okay, so we've talked about edges a lot and made vague references to a bunch of them. Can you give us a few? Like when we drop this in as an antagonist, or maybe we have a Kustos or a companion that we haven't quite figured out the full breadth of their power. Can you give us some notable or interesting edges that could pop up in our games?
Well, the first one that everyone thinks about when they think of Hunter's Reckoning is the iconic Avenger level 1. It's called Cleave, and it's the one from the core book. And it's not as powerful as everyone thinks it is, but it is a really good combat edge, and it's one of the best ones. What it does is you pick up something that can do damage on its own. I mean, you could technically use your fists or theoretically manifest a weapon with it, but those are rare. You're more typically picking up a knife or an axe or a baseball bat or something. And what it does is it adds +2 damage dice. If it doesn't already do lethal damage, it now does. But whatever the modifier that it has, so like a knife is a strength +1, for example, that's how many turns it has that it can be maintained on its own. After that amount of turns has passed, the power of your zeal is coursing through that weapon. And so you now have to make rolls every turn to see if that weapon shatters. But that's the one where a lot of people are like, oh yeah, he picks up a knife and it's wreathed in flames. And it might be, if you look at characters like a firefighter or has something like a affinity for fire. Every hunter's edges have take a different appearance based on their personality.
Dumb question. Does it do ag?
You know, that's actually not a dumb question, because Hunter the Reckoning does not deal with ag. In the Storytellers Handbook, they have a series of frequently asked questions. And one of the questions is, well, what edges do aggravate? So if you're doing a crossover, that's up to the individual storyteller. It may also be based character by character. You know, the character who has the purple glow on their cleave edge, for example, might not do ag. But the one who wreathes it in fire, yeah, he's probably going to do ag.
Or it may be based on that paradigm. For instance, I am the sword of the chosen who has come here to expunge the world of bloodsuckers, has no problem doing aggravated damage against licks, but against the Garu, maybe not so much. Or
yeah,
I am a witch hunter, I do aggravated damage against mages, which you don't need to do because, I mean, a pea shooter will take one out in most cases, but still. So that's another case where this paradigm thing could come into play.
And your paradigm is going to affect how it appears too. But other good edges, your defenders, for example, their level 1 edge, it's called Ward. They run between themselves and, between the whatever supernatural creature they're looking at and maybe its target. And they might shout, back off. And it creates this force bubble around them that will push out supernatural creatures. They have to roll to resist it. And as the defender gets more and more powerful and more zeal, it increases the radius of that, as well as making it more difficult to break through that. On the opposite extreme, defenders also get the earliest healing edge, and it's called Rejuvenate. It's an always active one for them that allows them to heal faster than normal humans. And then they can also touch someone else and spend conviction. And for every conviction they spend, 1 health level at the increased speed. Later ones, you have the more extreme healing. You have as a level 4 one for the Visionaries that can restore lost limbs. I've talked a bit about Bookworm 55. He's the iconic Innocent. He's the cover character for the Creed. And when the series started, he was in a wheelchair. His legs had been ripped off. And he was going around with this really high level visionary that he didn't necessarily agree with, but he was still learning from him. And when it became clear that the two did not agree, the visionary, as a last thing, just kind of went up to the guy, put his hands on the stumps of the legs, and his legs regrew. But you've also got your detection edges. Both Innocents, Martyrs, and Judges all have level 1 or level 2 edges. We talked about the Innocent one, which is called Illuminate, that creates the auras. Judges have one that lets them see perfectly in the dark through smoke, all that, and lets them kind of just discern those little details. It's actually called Discern. Oh, that guy's got fangs. Looking at him, he's got hair on the back of his hands or his palms or something. He might be a werewolf. And then the Martyrs have one called Witness that lets them see visions of the last interactions with supernatural creatures with normal people that these supernatural creatures had. So they can go, oh, he's been eating on people, or oh, he's protecting them, or this mage over here is handing them a $10 bill and they're bringing him $90 in change. What the hell? So they can kind of determine that. That's kind of your big 3 things: is you got your perception, your combat, your healing or protection, and then you just got the weird ones. Hermits, they have their ones that they can send their senses out, telepathically communicate with other hunters, that kind of stuff. Waywards, their whole thing is the generals. They can spend conviction for other hunters. He's being affected by delirium. He didn't get his second sight active. Well, pop it for him. Or I can send other hunters into a frenzy to make them fight for me. And the powers tend to fit with the personality associated with that creed. Redeemers have, let's protect this person. Let's ask this question that makes the creature remember their humanity. Your Visionaries are going to have ones about looking into the past of around an area to see, what happened here. Precognition.
And it seems to be arranged so that each character type kind of gets its moment of looking cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, I'm looking through some of these, and you have, like, Witness, which allows a character to recognize the supernatural creatures in her presence. And I don't know what mage wouldn't get the willies by a mortal suddenly just locking eyes on them. And the mage can detect nothing weird going on, or something like Be Calm. You get this video of a vampire just being killed on a busy street savagely by this group, and everyone just keeps walking by, and no sign of magic. Or the character gets targeted with one of the edges that is like, you need to answer this question truthfully, and suddenly they have to pass that on. Yeah, the level 5 ones are pretty impressive, but like a mage that gets hit by brand, where a character's hand crackles with energy and kind of a symbol in hunter language appears on them.
Yep.
And they don't know what it means, they don't know what it is, and they're not quite sure how to get rid of it, and it can stick around for quite some time, is kind of interesting. And the nature is...
And even more so interesting with that one is they can't, even if they try to cover it up with clothes or whatever, hunters will still see it.
Part of it is because you're frequently rolling like plus one of these virtues, they can get pretty high. These are pretty large dice pools for Old World of Darkness, which is partially what makes some of these systems kind of interesting. Anything else on the powers? Are there things like hunter artifacts or hunter group rights or hunter rituals?
The closest thing to that, I would say, is, I briefly mentioned this earlier, every creed within their book has a unique ability and most of those abilities are based around creating something. So, for example, the defender will create these little tokens or little charms that they can give to normal humans that want to protect, and it gives those people soak dice against supernatural abilities. Whereas, like, the innocent who also wants to protect them, there's this more mental health that'll protect that person from, like, the delirium, or it'll allow that person to have the effect of the level 1 edge of hide, which makes them beneath notice to the supernatural, these kinds of things. Visionaries can create, they'll take everything they've learned about the hunt and the messengers and whatnot, and they'll put it together into this book. Hunter the Reckoning actually has its own book called Apocrypha. It's kind of like the Book of Nod, where it's the in-universe one, and it's from Fyodor's notes. And he handed it off to Hermit. I believe he goes by Violin. The Hermit ability is the ability to disseminate. Other hunters will just find copies of it, or he might write it up as an email with no receiver address. It'll go out, and hunters will just suddenly have this as an email. So that's the closest thing there is to an artifact or rituals.
Are there special antagonists that hunters face? It's one of those things where I don't know if the game presumes that you're just running around wiping out demons and vampires. Do they have general monster of the week antagonists that they face? Or is this game very much just pointed at the other lines in the World of Darkness?
Yes and no. You don't have to have any of the other lines to play Hunter. They'll have their own stuff, and it's going to vary from story to story. You might have one storyteller who's just like, yep, my big bad is going to be a vampire, and you're going to be dealing with ghouls and vampires and this, that, and the other. But you might have another where it's like, no, we're going to be out in the woods, and so you're probably going to deal with werewolves and all that. They actually had a question kind of like that in the Storyteller's Guide, and they broke it down as to most common. 50% is what they list as the Walking Dead and ghosts. Hunter really does come out of the effects of the Sixth Great Maelstrom and all that, and how that threw the dead into bodies, objects, and so on here in the living world. They even break the Walking Dead into 3 categories, 2 of which existed prior in some form. What they call the hidden, for example, would be what under Wraith terms were the risen. They can pass as humans, they're smart, they have all their intelligence, they're capable of doing all these things. The opposite extreme are the shamblers, which would be like your stereotypical movie zombies that are usually summoned by necromancers or some other being who commands them, and they come in groups. And the one that's unique to this post Maelstrom world is what they call walkers, the in-between, that they literally have just one thing that they're passionate about from before their deaths. And maybe they're wanting to kill the person who killed them, kind of thing. And once they complete that goal, they usually just pass away again. The hidden might have the same kind of thing, and they actually give this example in the book. The hidden might have similar, like, oh, I want to kill these people, but the hidden will be like, okay, I'm going to get this job at the bank to get information on these people so I can figure out the best plan to do it. Whereas the walker will just be like, I'm going to walk right in and I'm going to kill them, and I'm going to kill everyone in the building that tries to stop me. After that, the most likely group is going to be your vampires. After that would be werewolves and other Farah, like vampires, The Walking Dead, and all that. That's like 80%. And then the shape changers are your 10%. So mages are about 8%, and then Fae are about 2%. And that's just because mages and Fae as a whole tend to be more subtle in what they do, and they're tend not to be as antagonistic towards humans as some of the other supernatural groups.
Do we get any, I guess you could say, unique to this game? Like, do we get something like a bygone bestiary that's like, here's a bunch of demons you could fight, or weird supernatural creatures, like, let's go kill some chupacabra or something like that?
The closest I would say would be the walkers. They basically have their own interpretation of all the various different other groups within the World of Darkness, and each one has its own book. You have The Walking Dead for all your zombie types. You've got Spellbound for mages and so on. But hunters are really a reaction. They don't have their own unique thing, but because of the way that the world changed after the Sixth Great Maelstrom and the Week of Nightmares, they're kind of the first ones that, were dealing with zombies on their own. They're not risen and not necessarily, summoned by necromancers or anything. They're just there because these ghosts have been shoved into bodies, and they're not necessarily their own bodies either. They're just a body that they're animating.
It seems like one of the things they can bring to the table is they may be subject matter experts for Shamblers, Walking Dead, or other necromantic creatures that may be causing issues. So we've talked a lot about the hunters and how they work. How do you see a hunter working with a mage? It seems as if the adversarial part is kind of obvious. They detect magic. They don't like it. You have some sort of anti-corporatist group of hunters that is very much interested in messing up the operations of the technocracy. They're able to somehow determine that a particular bank or banking house is tied to some seedy syndicate activity, or using their special site, they're able to figure out the underworld operations that various groups use to fund themselves. It seems like there is no aspect of mage activity, maybe with the exception of the Umbra, that is safe from the eyes of prying hunters. But with that, is there anything comes to mind where you see like an obvious team up?
There's lots of great ways. I gave the example earlier of the orphan and the imbued, where they're both just like, I don't know what's going on. The world is not what I thought it is. And they're just kind of working together. But another good example, we'll look at the purple and bookworm thing again. Purple probably looked at bookworm as some kind of new sorcerer, or psychic or something like that, with had his abilities. And we do see that kind of thing, that kind of mindset of, with the revised era books that do mention the imbued, is, yeah, these guys are something. And so you could have that here. We think you're this. Let's try to bring you into the fold and teach you about our paradigm, kind of thing, from the mage's perspective. Or it could be a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You could have, for example, hunters are tracking down what they think is a necromancer who's summoning these, shamblers going on, and the mages are going, oh, this is enough fondness in our territory. We need to deal with this. And they both come in to interact with the big fight or something at the same time. They're like, okay, we may hate each other, but we hate them more. So let's work together for that for now.
And I like the thing you mentioned earlier, that if nothing else, they can be kind of confusing. That, oh, I think you're a sorcerer. Well, I think you're awakened. And someone else is like, no, you are the chosen one as foretold in legends. And especially as this character starts notching up victories, especially if you have a war chantry or a group that does fight on the front lines. For instance, I think about the Knights of St. Stephen or the Knights of Rhadamanthus, or any of the groups in Mage that specialize in taking them out, until something happens and your friendly neighborhood imbued realizes that maybe he's not working for the good guys, or he meets more hunters of hunter kind who are like, you're not working for the good guys. They're just a different, your purples over there are just another kind of bad. So that's one of those things where we can have this internal tension that eventually builds, and your mages need to be the one to say, no, we mages, just like everything else humans do, have this good side or this bad side, and we would very much like your help taking out the bad guys. Whereas other people are like, they claim to be the next step in humanity, where in actuality they are a step away. They have sold themselves, or whatever story the other hunters give them. This game seems like one that absolutely thrives on no one having the complete picture, in a way that I think is fascinating and can really help if a group is kind of like jaded. Like, it's a very new type of piece on the board of the Ascension conflict, and that seems fascinating.
And it absolutely is. And that's a great way for hunter players that like to deal with the mages, look at the mages like, oh, maybe you have some answers. They may see them as kindred spirits, for example, like the technocrats, or, with like Strike Force Zero or something like that, where they're like, oh, yeah, these guys are actually kind of organized and they know what they're doing. Why aren't we like that?
And this very much seems like a thing where someone could presume that someone is an extraordinary citizen, but at certain moments, their hunteredness expresses itself. And maybe because the nature of it, it is not obvious to the rest of the technocrats what is going on. If you're using that cleave ability and it happens to be the baton that they carry around, and the effect of it is not a holy fire, but no obvious physical effect, then I could perfectly see, well, the technocrats are like, well, we don't detect any reality deviance when he does it. He just seems to be real good at wailing on people, so that's pretty great.
And a better example of that would be the martyr level 1 edge called Demand. Martyrs have this weird thing where some of their edges, they take an unsoakable bashing damage in exchange for a big boost. And Demand does that, and it's whatever your mercy level is, you get that many strength dice added up to your one action. Okay, I've got the baton, but suddenly I just gained +6 strength.
Or they have the ability to throw a car seemingly off of someone, and the NWO is fine because it shows the power of citizens acting under duress. And again, it's amazing how much of this is just the fact that the optics of it may just look utterly mundane, or this doesn't look like reality deviance to the technocrats, so they don't even bother investigating it.
Speaking of optics, it's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because hunters are, generally speaking, undetectable. They absolutely don't know what it is. But there is one exception. That is, when they have second sight active, if you're doing an aura perception, you suddenly see them in what is usually gold, like the Hermetic standard, that very divine aura.
Oh, interesting. So when they are seeing, they too, in certain senses, can be seen.
Yes and no. Like, you can always see their auras. They look like anybody else. They just like normal human beings. But when they activate their second sight, they suddenly become as a divinish being. Same as someone who has true faith might look.
Okay, that makes sense. So it is apparent that they may be something else when this particular thing is happening, but what is certainly never answered.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who generally hates auras because it forces me as a storyteller to have to come up with another fact at the table, that seems like a perfectly reasonable use for it. What other interfaces do you see between hunters and mages? Do hunters ever turn their attention towards objects? Is it one of those things where you could see hunters attempting to destroy grimoires or wonders or something, or do they generally focus on beings?
That's one of those things that's actually got a question in the Storytellers Handbook. And that frequently asked question is, can they detect items, supernatural text? And that's sure, if you want them to. So yeah, you could absolutely have we've seen this thing. We know that it's something supernatural. We need to get our hands on it. And so it could become one of those, heist movie kind of things where you've got two different groups both competing to get to the prize first, where you've got the hunters and the mages both going after this grimoire or this ancient artifact, or maybe working together for it.
Or a mage's first encounter with them is that when one of their manor houses is raided for what seems to be a very simple B&E, but it turns out they took something more than they bargained for, and they get the sense that, oh no, they knew exactly what they were doing to an extent. They knew they were taking something important, even if they don't know what it is. And I always think there's space in a tabletop for the story of the gentleman thief.
And it can be a simple thing, even as just, okay, this mage is sitting there having dinner at a diner and uses a mind effect or maybe mind forces to make that, he hands them a 10 and they think it's 100. So he's getting all this change back. And in response to that, someone's kind of just starts shining light and then looks in their direction.
Which is nice, because in Mage, we don't have a lot of examples of those absolutely banal coincidental effects ever really coming back to be a problem for the player.
Because hubris is the major overarching theme one of the major overarching themes, but one of the lesser ones is that mages are kind of selfish dicks. And so, hunters are great for a reaction to that.
And when they are not being selfish, they are generally being generous to very specific people on very specific terms, where it's like, yes, I believe in the furthering of humanity. It just so happens that humanity happens to be the people with similar ethnic backgrounds to me that have a set of beliefs that if I gain power will enhance my paradigm. So mage generosity. So talking some more specific things, to you, do you think it's reasonable that a hunter would be able to detect either a node, quintessence, TAS, or paradox?
I'm going to go with no to all of the above. The closest that you might have is there's a visionary edge called, I think it's pinpoint, that lets them detect a weakness.
Okay.
So they might target a mage with it and see that, oh, this location is the source of his power. And that might be the closest way that they would detect, oh, that's a node. They wouldn't know what it is, but they go, okay, let's destroy this place. And now the mage is weakened.
Okay, so they're able to detect the periapt or something like that that fuels all of their stuff, or the paradox flaw that one of their limbs is withered or something like that, and that kind of makes it obvious. Okay, cool. Do hunters have a good defense against the 10th sphere? Gun. Are they good against, let's say, mundane sources of harm?
Nope. They are literally everyday humans. That's one of the big themes of Hunter is your characters are normal people and usually even more like blue collar, lower class, maybe middle class. What if my character's from the Inquisition or something like that? It's like, yeah, you technically can do that if you didn't have any supernatural abilities. Like they can't have access to true faith or the various sorcerer's pass, the theurgy and whatnot that the Inquisition has. They can never have been a ghoul. The thing is they have to never have had interaction with the supernatural in the past. That is a huge emphasis on the normal mortal. If they survive a bullet wound, there are certain edges that let them heal faster, like I talked about rejuvenation earlier. Like mages, they have no supernatural defenses against anything.
There's no like level 3 edge that is like soak aggravated or like a holy light armor or something like that.
Nope, they can't soak lethal. Like I said, they don't even recognize aggravated. Everything is either bashing or lethal hunters.
Everything hurts. If you're not being punched or hit by a beanbag, it's going to do a wallop to you. In your view, what do you think hunters would view of groups that maybe suppress reality deviance, like as I mentioned, the technocracy, or maybe the Palatine Knights?
It's gonna vary from hunter to hunter. Some of your more zealous ones might be like, yeah, I like these guys. But they might just as likely be like, let's keep an eye on them, because maybe once they're done clearing out all their stuff, we can clear them out.
And it very much feels from what you say that this kind of active push and pull and tension between hunters is kind of core to the game. That
it can be.
Yeah, you can have the Scooby Gang or what have you, but it certainly, the game does not seem to break if before the group decides to act, I don't know what the collective noun for hunters are, that there is a fair amount of arguing and coming to compromise, or being like, okay, you get it on this one, but the next one we get to flat out murder it or something like that. And I think there's a really interesting story opportunity to be like, oh no, these weird things, they're obviously on our side, until they meet some hunter who is who is unpleased with the fact that technocracy has been putting down these strange and wonderful creatures without investigating it. And do they too not see that they themselves are also monsters in the same vein? Who are they to judge?
Yeah, and that would exactly be like a redeemer. I'm thinking would be that kind of like, oh my God, why are you killing these people?
The most recent set of questions have all been those asked through the Discord. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions there and fueling this lovely interview with Ranae. The hunters are very much tied to the time of judgment. What to you can we do to have hunters without there being a time of judgment? Do you feel the game still makes sense if they have always existed?
I don't know that I would say that they always existed. It's like I kind of said earlier, like they are the newest incarnation of something that has existed throughout the ages and has usually fallen. So yeah, they don't necessarily, the time of judgment didn't need to isn't their whole purpose is to prevent the time of judgment. If you think about it, they were made to prevent the end of the world and keep another cycle going, get it once more run through the world before it falls apart to another time of judgment. So if they succeed and the time of judgment didn't happen, well, great, they were successful. Let's keep them around.
One of the devs for Onyx Path, Matthew Dawkins, talked about wanting to do a game where the time of judgment was averted. The messengers left and took the power of the imbued with them. So no one has any access to the edges anymore, except for maybe these vague tinglings from moment to moment. And having these bitter mortals that aren't quite sure what to do seems like a fascinating angle, and that seems to get us more towards Hunter the Vigil. One of my thoughts is that they could just be another form of the pure ones. We get the idea in Ascension that there was the one and then there was the other, and that's where the shards from the Avatar Storm are coming from, and each person can host one. There's nothing saying that the messengers weren't some other kind of psychopomp dealing with some other kind of shard if you don't want to take the messenger Elohim Kuijin angle, which I think is fascinating. But I think it's also pretty malleable. Like, they presented an option where everything kind of ties together nicely. I don't know if I go full on the Alaru, where the messengers were the Elohim that were in Enoch in terms of glomming onto the metaplot, but you got some directions that they came with.
In the Storyteller's Guide, they actually say it when they bring that up, like, this is what is official, but if you don't like it, throw it out. Have the messengers be aliens. Have them be this, that, the other, whatever you want to do.
And it seems perfectly reasonable that the mages would also argue over what they represent, in the same way that, to some extent, there was kind of this idea in 1E Dreamspeakers that Gaia had failed with the Garu and was trying again with humans, and that's how you got the Dreamspeakers. And the 1E Dreamspeakers are kind of interesting because they're just this absolute rando cross-section of humans that have been tapped by Gaia. And this seems to be another thing. Like, I could certainly see the Imbued being the immune system of Gaia if we wanted it to be. And I don't know, that to me would seem like it would freak the F out of the Garu if they'd say, oh, well, what are humans? And they say they are the adaptation of Gaia. They are the most malleable of Gaia's species, or something like that, or the ones most able to change their surroundings. Take that, beaver. And
that immune system thing is actually one of my favorite interpretations. I think it's God 45, the signature wayward. I think that was his interpretation of it, is that the imbued are the immune system of the earth trying to fight against the infection that the supernatural is.
And it certainly makes sense that in a V5 world where you have the Second Inquisition that is going around doing its stuff, or the Coalition, as everyone else refers to it as, that this could just be another manifestation of it. And you go through metaphysical history for something and you're like, oh, this was also big during the Crusades or during the Black Death or something like that, that extreme times have called it, maybe during the War of Princes or something within Vampire, or during the start of the Ascension War. It kind of became a thing, and now suddenly mages are like, oh no, there's a new piece on the battlefield and its only interest is in killing us, and it does not care what type of what faction you are a part of. And that seems like a good opportunity to have some strange bedfellows stories where you're like, well, they seemingly want to kill all awakened. Do I have more in common with a Nefandis, who at least wants magic to perpetuate, even if they want to continue ruling over the ruins of a desolated earth or something like that? Or this person that wants to see its destruction or something like that? Or they go on this thing where they are able to see nodes and start tearing those up across the surface of the planet, whether it be, and suddenly that unleashes unknown horrors that are kept in place with ley lines or whatever you want your standard story to be. You got directions.
And you can do whatever you want with it. I mean, even in the example that you said of, like, well, they've lost their powers. That just lends itself into Hunter's Hunter. They can start forming together a new group akin to the Inquisition or the Arcanum or something like that.
Do you have any other thoughts for how a mage might subtly interface with a hunter? Like, one of the ones I think that comes to mind is the idea that hunters kind of recognize when they are maybe outclassed, and one of their informants could be a hunter cell that is like, we don't know how to deal with this thing. Our second sight does not detect mages, maybe, or only in the faintest glimmer, and it detects all sorts of weird magic users. So we're just going to job this out to you whenever we get a case of something supernatural in a weird way happening that doesn't fit within our thing. So suddenly you have, like, hunter as quest giver. I also kind of like the angle of, especially in a world where mages think that they are the true masters of the world, what is it that we have these, and you've used the term before, what is it now that we have this blue-collar awakening, as it were, that you have a lot of elitist mages, and you're like, well, these people seem to be the opposite of elite. The only thing they did was they answered the call to act, and they acted. Maybe we need to reconsider what we have been doing. Or alternatively, they're like, you have this remarkably classist mage who's like, no, I will not be undone by these upstarts. Like, what other interesting either angles for reflection or interfaces do you see between hunters and mages, if any?
But going off of the example you just gave is hunters, when they look at something supernatural with their second sight, if they're not using a detection edge to get more information, they don't have a set, this is what it is. They don't know what it is when they look at this person who's a mage. Each individual hunter is going to see or sense or detect something different. And if they keep following that individual mage, then each time that they look at them with second sight a new time, they might get something different. So they might very much be I have no idea what's going on here. We've already talked about them working well with the more aggressive ones working with like the more terrestrial reforms of the Union as, oh, hey, yeah, these are exceptional citizens. But I love the idea of just, take that street level thing with the orphans and your hollow ones and just be like, they're all trying to make sense of what the heck is going on with their world. You can also be as a not beneficial as a response to if you're just doing a mage game and your mage players are screwing over, normal mortals, be like, okay, well, maybe not a full on slap you down, but make you stop and think, maybe I shouldn't be doing that because I'm drawing attention, and have those tradition mages think, wait, is this a new form of technocrat or is this a marauder or what is going on here?
Yeah, I kind of like the idea that they're a new form of paradox. That Paradox has become much more self-aware, which again is another weird idea that we get from 1E, that Paradox is this active agent, and whether or not that is the truth of the matter, I could certainly see mages interpreting it as such, that there is this...
Oh, I absolutely love the earlier editions with Paradox. The spirits, like the wrinkle.
Yeah, and I think the giveaway to me was in the digital web book. They talk about John von Neumann, and they said the Paradox spirits were waiting for him to blank. And I'm like, oh man, I like the Paradox as weather phenomenon that just happens to you, but I also like Paradox as conscious agent from we're not quite sure what. And and when I do a mage retrospective on how the nature of paradox and belief has changed over time, I'll get to talk about that. But anytime we get to reskin something and surprise our players in an interesting way, I like that. And you're talking about the orphan idea, and to me, that's way more interesting than being like, Bob's also a werewolf. And you're like, well, I'm a normal looking person. You're a normal looking person. It just so happens
we both can do stuff, and neither one of us understands it.
Exactly. And we're trying to vibe.
But the opposite extreme is like, I like the idea of like the Akashic trying to be like, I am going to teach you about the Tao, and the hunter's like, the what now? Or the Hermetic trying to be like, oh, we got to do this exact specific thing, and this is how this, and the hunter's just like, yeah, I just say back off, and that's all it is.
Yeah. Why are you making this so complicated? I have no reason to train in this.
Because they have their own triggers. Like each individual character has their own trigger for how they activate their edges too. One might be like back off, and the other will be like making the sign of the cross on themselves, or what have you.
Mm-hmm. It is not involved. They are not ritual practitioners. They do not need 7 drops of blood from a virgin harvested by a silver dagger, and nor are they quite so comical, say, as maybe some of the bunks that we would get for changelings. Should they count as witnesses for the purposes of magic?
Oh, absolutely, because that's very much the theme of they're normal people 90% of the time. It also works very well with that whole thing of them being the immune system of Earth kind of concept as well.
They are witnesses with a capital W.
Yes.
They are the witnesses to reality. And obviously, if a storyteller wants to change that, they can. We're positing a crossover where almost no rules were ever done. This has been pretty fascinating. If we are interested in figuring out maybe how to weave them in, do you have a recommendation for maybe the first 1 or 2 texts that we should look at?
Well, absolutely the core book.
Okay.
And then since we're talking Mage, I would say Spellbound. It's the hunter book, the antagonist book for the mages, and that gives them kind of the hunter's perspective of what mages are and how they interact with them. But also just follow anything that has bookworm in it. I think he's one of the ones you're following in the Innocent Creed book because of his relationship with Purple, the Hermetic.
I am just behind any group that refers to mages collectively as the Purples.
Well, that's his code name for that one specific mage. I think the general overarching term is warlocks.
Okay.
But Every hunter has their own different terms for everything.
I was hoping it was like, we live in a world of vampires, werewolves, ghouls, ghosts, and purples. And I'm like, I think I'd be okay with that. And this is something where the White Wolf Wiki has a fair amount of stuff in it. Are there any non-book resources we hunter curious should investigate?
There are a lot of shows and movies that kind of hit the theme a little bit, but not really. The first one that comes to mind is the first season or two of Supernatural. You look at their father, not rather than the brothers, and he's like, he comes home, one night and he sees his wife's on the ceiling and fire bursts around her, and he realizes that he learns that it's a demon. But any kind of thing where it's a character just has their world dropped out from underneath them. Some of the Marvel series I like Moon Knight is running right now, and just that perspective that the character of Stephen Grant, who doesn't know what the hell is going on, even though his other personalities do, it can be very fitting for that kind of thing. If you're dealing with a character who has a derangement, absolutely look into stuff that has that derangement, that fits that, or the DSM, or whatever your nation's respective psychological manual is. Make sure you're role playing in a way that does not offend, would or make light of the actual mental health issues. They actually had a series of video games, but they're not great for necessarily getting the feel of things, but they're still fun.
I ran into those when I was trying to find all of the last of the paperback books that I needed. I think Hunter was the last set that I finished, and I would just like eBay Hunter, and it was just hundreds of copies of used Xbox discs, and I'm like, oh yeah, they had that.
They had 3 of them, and the fun thing is they jumped across systems. The first one was Xbox, the original Xbox. The second one was PS2, and then the third one went back to the original Xbox. They're fun, but they're not great for the theme. Like they kind of touch on it, but everyone thinks of like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and before that Redemption, which were the only successful other World of Darkness games that got video games. The werewolf ones, up until this most recent one, all failed. They never got off the ground. Mage never got off the ground, even though they tried it. The MMO never got off the ground. If you are doing a high action game, those are great for your mood where it's like the whole city's being overrun. There's a city on a Neil, and there's just zombies everywhere. But that's not really your low level starting kind of characters. Those are your high level hunters that are going to be dealing with that kind of thing.
Do you have anything else that you'd like to add before we roll out?
For those of you who have not given Hunter the Reckoning a try because you've the reputation of it, absolutely, just give it a look. One of the problems that Hunter has had is it's got this bad reputation. Like people are looking at like Hunter the Vigil is so much better than Hunter the Reckoning because it's got that personal level kind of thing, and it's not just all Rambo and this, that, and the other. And it's Hunter the Reckoning actually does have more in common with Vigil and Hunter's Hunted than most people give it credit for. But the artwork and the merch, the advertising and all that gave it that high action theme. There's the picture literally in the book of an old man with a cane in one hand stabbing a spoon through the stomach of a warformed werewolf. And that kind of thing makes people think it's this high action thing. And it can be, but it's more like Hunter, like I said, it's more like an Arcanum game or a Hunter's Hunted, where it's your world has been turned upside down. How do you react from it? Do you keep your day job? Or do you liquidate all your stuff to get ammo? How are you reacting to this change in things? Look at the Truman Show, and as he's learning that his world is not what he believes it is. That's the themes that Hunter really thrives on, and why it works so well with Mage.
Nice. Ranae, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have a social media presence that anyone should follow?
I have a YouTube channel that I'm actually where I do Let's Plays and all that. I'm going to start getting reviews for various video games. You can find my Twitter for that at Sleep Inc. INC Gaming, and the YouTube channel is called Sleep Incarnate Gaming.
Nice. We'll include links to those in the show notes. And hey, look, there's the channel with a brightly colored lass before me, and we'll include that if you're interested in finding out more of what Renae's doing and these games reviews and such. That will be in the show notes. Ranae, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where our favorite virtues are zeal, fortitude, and peppermint. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, and those supporters are Buck Farmer, Oracle of the virtue of being able to tell a server the dish was prepared incorrectly without making a big deal out of it. Regina O'Reilly, Oracle of the virtue of participating in office fundraisers. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the virtue of remembering people's names. Mikhail, Oracle of the virtue of remembering other people's food allergies. And Jay Widener, Oracle of the virtue of politely asking people to take off their shoes before stepping inside of your home. Additionally, we'd like to thank Alex, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hebert, Boo, Boogers, 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 Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsick, Elliot Osborne, Gargle Noir, George Lara, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Biggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Prohl, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, W. Starter, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout is to Matthew Prohl. Normally, if I don't know anything about someone, I Google their surname, and in this case, I typed P-R-O-E, and Google auto-completed with Prolific Park outside Greensboro, North Carolina, which is apparently a family fitness center centered on the whole child. Interestingly, Whole Child was capitalized, suggesting that that is the name of an entity called the Whole Child who takes oblations in the form of a family's fitness or sweat. The perspiration in the air condenses and is collected to nourish the growing whole child until our soreness allows it to birth into our reality once it is complete. Once it does, Prolific Park will celebrate by offering 25% off memberships as well as light refreshments. Thank you, Matt. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.